What would you do if the person you loved kept saying no, not once, not twice, but for decades, and you stayed anyway? I'm asking because at 19 I believed love was simple, stubborn, and unstoppable. And the first time I asked her to marry me, I was absolutely certain she would say yes. I still remember the way my hands shook, not from fear but from confidence. I had no doubt. We were young, deeply in love, and everyone around us assumed marriage was the obvious next step. That's how things worked back then. You met, you fell in love, you built a life, or at least that's what I thought. When she said no, it didn't sound cruel, it sounded careful. She didn't raise her voice or reject me outright. She just looked down, paused longer than I expected, and said she wasn't ready. Not now. Maybe someday. I laughed it off, told myself it didn't matter, that timing was a detail. Inside, though, something shifted. Not enough to scare me away, but enough to plant a question I wouldn't fully face for many years. Why would someone who loved me hesitate like that? We kept going. We dated, we planned, we talked about the future in broad, comforting terms. Trips we'd take, places we'd live, the kind of life we wanted. And in my mind, marriage was already included. It felt inevitable. That certainty made me bold. So I asked again. Different place, different moment, same answer. Not yet. Each refusal came wrapped in affection, in reassurance, in promises that sounded safe enough to believe. She loved me, she said. She just didn't believe in marriage the way I did. At the time, I told myself that patience was proof of love, that waiting was noble, that persistence meant devotion, not desperation. I didn't realize how easy it is when you're young to confuse endurance with certainty. Every time she said no, I adjusted the story in my head instead of questioning it. I told myself we were different, that our love didn't need labels, that someday, without me pushing, she would choose me fully. What I didn't understand then was that the first no is never just a no. It's the beginning of a pattern. And once you accept the first one without really listening to what it means, you start building a life around waiting. A life where hope becomes habit, and habit slowly turns into identity. I didn't know it yet, but that first proposal wasn't just the beginning of our love story. It was the beginning of a very long test of patience, pride, and quiet endurance that would define nearly half a century of my life. If this story is already making you uncomfortable, that's a good thing, because stories like this aren't just about love, marriage, or old age. They're about the choices we normalize without questioning, the silences we accept, and the years we trade for hope without realizing the cost. What you're hearing isn't fiction. It's a real emotional pattern that plays out quietly in countless relationships, especially long marriages built on patience, compromise, and unspoken fears. Understanding this kind of story helps you recognize emotional persistence, delayed commitment, and the fine line between devotion and self-sacrifice before decades pass. I want you to pause for a moment and really think about what this brings up for you. Have you ever waited for someone to choose you fully? Have you ever convinced yourself that love would eventually fix everything if you just held on a little longer? Leave a comment and tell me what this story made you reflect on. Even a single word like waiting, hope, or fear helps this conversation reach the people who need it most. If stories about marriage, long-term love, hidden regrets, and late confessions matter to you, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It tells the platform that these real human stories deserve to be heard, especially by people who are still in the middle of their own difficult choices. Why would someone stay in a relationship where love is present, years are passing, and commitment keeps being postponed without a clear reason? That question haunted me long before I had the courage to admit it. After the first few proposals, her refusals began to follow a pattern that felt gentle on the surface, but heavy underneath. She never said she didn't love me. She never said she didn't want a future with me. What she said, again and again, was that marriage scared her in ways she couldn't fully explain. She talked about watching her parents grow distant, about arguments that never ended, about promises that turned into obligations. To her, marriage wasn't romance. It was risk. It was permanence. It was the fear of becoming trapped in a version of life she couldn't escape once the words were spoken. I listened, nodded, reassured her that we would be different, that our love was stronger, that I would never become the kind of man she feared. And I meant every word. But what I didn't see then was that fear doesn't respond to logic, and reassurance doesn't erase wounds formed long before you arrive. As the years passed, those early refusals began to change how I saw myself, quietly, slowly. I started measuring my worth against her hesitation. Was I not enough? Was I asking too much? Or was I simply loving someone who needed something different from love itself? These questions stayed unspoken, buried under routines, shared laughter, and the comfort of familiarity. We built a life that looked committed from the outside, but inside, there was a gap that never fully closed. Each new proposal came with a slightly different version of hope. A different place, a different moment, a different promise that this time might be the one. And each time she said no, it felt softer than the last, but heavier in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself that patience was strength, that love meant understanding her fears more than honoring my own needs. I convinced myself that asking less of her made me more loving, more loyal, more worthy of staying. But there's something people don't talk about when it comes to long-term relationships and delayed commitment. The waiting doesn't stay neutral. It changes you. It teaches you to lower expectations, to swallow disappointment quietly, to smile while carrying questions you're afraid to ask out loud. Over time, you stop asking when. You stop asking why. You start telling yourself that the answer will come when it's supposed to. What I didn't realize then was that every unanswered proposal wasn't just about marriage. It was about power, fear, timing, and the unspoken agreement that I would keep waiting as long as she felt safe. And the longer I stayed silent, the more normal that arrangement became. If this part of the story feels familiar to you, if it stirs something uncomfortable, leave a comment with a word that captures it for you. Maybe fear, waiting, or uncertainty. As the years went by, our lives became entwined in ways that were comforting and familiar, yet quietly fragile. We built routines, shared secrets, and celebrated milestones together, but the absence of a formal yes hung over us like a shadow that neither of us spoke about. Love was constant, undeniable, but expectations silently diverged. I dreamed of a life that declared our commitment openly, while she clung to a freedom she feared losing the moment I received my answer. We attended weddings together, shared holidays, and even made plans for a future that never had a legal acknowledgement. Each birthday, each trip, each small victory we celebrated, I measured silently against the question I never voiced aloud. Would there ever be a day when she would truly choose me in the way I imagined? And she, I suspect, measured every gesture, every promise, against a fear of permanence that I could not dismantle with words or love alone. In those years, I learned the subtle art of balancing devotion with patience and hope with realism. Every shared morning coffee, every long conversation under streetlights was both a reassurance and a reminder of what was missing. And yet, the love we cultivated was so deep, so real, that it made the absence of marriage almost invisible. Almost. There were moments, rare but sharp, when the question of forever made its presence known. A glance, a pause, a sigh. The weight of what we weren't, and perhaps never would be, pressed quietly into the corners of our shared life. During these years, friends would ask, "Why haven't you married?" And I'd give the practiced smile, a shrug, a deflection. What could I say without betraying her trust or exposing my own longing? To the world, it looked like contentment. To me, it was a daily negotiation between desire and patience, between expectation and love, between persistence and surrender. Each day reinforced a lesson I would understand fully only much later. Love alone is not always enough to bridge fear, timing, and human hesitation. If this resonates with you, if it stirs memories of your own unspoken compromises or waiting in love, leave a comment with the word that fits: longing, patience, or endurance. It helps create a conversation for those who felt the quiet ache of years spent in hope and devotion. There were proposals that didn't just end in a quiet no, but in long silences that felt heavier than any argument. By then, we were no longer young. We had history, shared memories, habits that made separation feel impossible. And yet, those moments came frighteningly close to tearing everything apart. Each time I asked again, it wasn't just hope speaking. It was desperation disguised as devotion. I needed clarity, not romance, and she could feel it. That's when the fear between us became visible. I remember one night in particular, sitting across from her at a small kitchen table, the kind of table that holds years of meals and unspoken conversations. I asked her again, not softly this time, not playfully, but honestly. I told her I needed to know if she ever planned to say yes. She didn't answer right away. She stared at her hands, then at me, and for the first time she said something that terrified me. She said she wasn't sure she ever would. Not because she didn't love me, but because love and marriage were not the same thing in her mind. That was the first time I considered leaving. Not dramatically, not with raised voices or slammed doors, but quietly, in my thoughts, late at night, when she was asleep. I asked myself whether staying was an act of love or an act of fear. Fear of starting over. Fear of loneliness. Fear that this was the best I would ever have. At the same time, she began to pull away, just enough for me to notice. She talked about independence, about not wanting to feel pressured, about how my questions made her feel cornered. We were both hurting, but in different languages. Those proposals changed the balance between us. They introduced a tension that never fully disappeared. Every affectionate moment carried a question. Every disagreement felt heavier, as if it might finally be the one that ended everything. And yet, we stayed. We stayed because walking away after so many years felt like erasing our own lives. We stayed because love, even complicated love, creates its own gravity. At some point, waiting stops feeling like patience and starts feeling like time pressing its full weight against your chest. I didn't notice the moment it changed, but I felt it. We were no longer talking about someday in abstract terms. Someday had started to look like a shrinking window instead of an open horizon. Friends began to age, parents passed away, our faces changed in the mirror, and I started to wonder what it meant to grow old next to someone who loved me deeply, yet still hesitated to choose me completely. There's a strange loneliness that comes with that kind of love. You share a bed, a home, routines that feel like marriage in every way except the one that matters to you. On the surface, nothing is missing. Underneath, there's a quiet grief you don't know how to name. I loved her. I still do. But loving someone while carrying unanswered questions for decades changes how you move through the world. You become careful with your hopes. You stop imagining futures too clearly, because clarity hurts when it never arrives. As the years passed, people assumed we were married. We stopped correcting them. It was easier to let the world believe we had crossed that line than to explain why we hadn't. But every assumption felt like a small lie I carried for both of us. Inside, I asked myself questions I never voiced out loud. If something happened to me tomorrow, would I be remembered as her partner, or just as the man who waited? Would my life be defined by love, or by patience stretched too thin? Aging has a way of stripping away illusions. You start to see time not as something you have, but as something you are spending. And every year, without an answer, felt like a choice I was making, even if I told myself I wasn't choosing anything at all. I realized that staying was an active decision, not a passive one. Loving her meant accepting the cost of loving her. And the cost was uncertainty, pride swallowed daily, and a future that never fully belonged to me. There were nights I lay awake beside her, listening to her breathe, wondering whether love was supposed to feel this heavy at the end of a long life. I never doubted her affection. I doubted my place in it. And yet, leaving after all that time felt impossible. Walking away would have meant admitting that waiting had shaped my entire adult life. Staying meant accepting that love sometimes asks you to live with unanswered questions until time itself forces an answer. If this part of the story stirred something in you, leave a comment with a word that fits how it feels, maybe time, choice, or regret. By the time I asked her for the 47th time, hope was no longer the thing pushing me forward. Hope had worn itself thin over the years, stretched by waiting, softened by disappointment, reshaped into something quieter and almost unrecognizable. I wasn't asking because I believed she would finally say yes. I was asking because I needed to know, once and for all, whether this chapter of my life would end with certainty or remain unfinished forever. I didn't plan anything special that time. No ring hidden in a pocket, no speech rehearsed in my head, no attempt to choose the perfect moment. We were older, slower, more honest with each other than we had ever been. We were sitting together in the living room, the television on but muted, the kind of ordinary evening that makes up most of a long life. And that's when I said it. Almost casually, almost tired. I asked if she wanted to marry me. Not as a dream, not as a promise, as a question that had waited long enough. She didn't answer right away. That silence felt different from all the others. It wasn't defensive, it wasn't distant. It was heavy with something like fear and surrender mixed together. She told me she had spent most of her life believing marriage would take something away from her, her independence, her identity, her sense of control. But now, after all these years, she realized that what scared her most wasn't marriage anymore. It was the idea of losing me without ever having said yes. When she finally said it, it didn't come with celebration or tears. It came quietly, almost matter of fact. Yes, just yes. And in that moment, I didn't feel victory. I felt relief. A deep, settling relief that came not from being chosen, but from no longer having to wait. Nearly half a century of questions fell silent all at once. Not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because uncertainty had finally loosened its grip. That proposal didn't erase the years that came before it. It didn't undo the waiting or the doubts or the quiet costs of loving her the way I did. But it gave those years a shape, a boundary, an ending that allowed me to breathe again. I realized then that some answers arrive late, not to reward patience, but to teach us what patience actually costs. And sometimes the yes you stop expecting is the one that finally comes. If you've stayed with this story until now, it's because it touched something deeper than a simple love story. This isn't just about a man who proposed 47 times. It's about waiting, choosing, fear, timing, and the quiet decisions that shape entire lives without ever making noise. Understanding stories like this helps you look at your own relationships with more honesty, especially the ones built on patience, sacrifice, and unspoken expectations. I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever waited for someone to choose you fully, or struggled with a decision that took years to face? Leave a comment with a word that describes what this story stirred in you. It could be waiting, fear, relief, or even love. Your comment helps this story reach people who may be living inside a similar silence right now. If these real, emotional stories about marriage, long-term love, regret, and late-life revelations matter to you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to support more stories like this being told honestly, without shortcuts.